Have you ever wondered how a man can hold in his hands the power over an entire country with almost 200 million people, and how no one from his entourage dares to go against him? Stalin was able to do this, but not because he was the smartest or the strongest. It was all about his unique system of government in which no one could feel safe, not even his closest associates. It was important to Stalin that his entourage did not unite. He was constantly organizing games where he pitted some people against others, while he himself watched from the sidelines. Now imagine, you, a member of the narrow circle of power, and your every word can be recorded and used against you. Stalin personally ordered the installation of microphones in the offices and homes of some associates. Even people like Molotov, who had worked beside him for decades, knew they were constantly being listened to. Once Molotov's wife mentioned a joke about Stalin in a private conversation, and a week later she found herself under investigation. What's interesting is that Stalin used this fear to consolidate his power. People feared him more than an army of enemies, and this is not just conjecture. For example, in 1941, during the German invasion, many members of the Politburo thought not about how to save the country, but about not being accused of defeatism. In such a system, all decisions were made not collectively, but on the basis of fear and cunning. But here the question arises, was Stalin the only real leader of the country, or were there other, less visible but no less influential figures behind him? You'll be surprised to learn how some of his closest people played a double game to stay alive. When we talk about Stalin's power, it seems that he single-handedly ran everything from the army to agriculture. But this is not quite so. He had an inner circle, people who helped him run the country, made important decisions, and implemented the most brutal orders. However, these associates were not ordinary colleagues. They were more like pawns in the complex game that Stalin was playing for the sake of his control. One such person was Vyacheslav Molotov. His name is known by many because of the non-aggression pact with Germany, but few know of his real role in the repression. Molotov signed thousands of firing lists, and he did it as coldly as if he were approving lists to buy equipment. However, there were real dramas in his personal life. His wife, Polina Zemchuzhina, was arrested and exiled despite Molotov's own influence. Nevertheless, he continued to write her warm letters and remained a faithful husband. This duality, being both part of a system of repression and preserving human feelings, makes Molotov's figure particularly enigmatic. Another key player is Lavrentiy Beria, the head of the NKVD. He was feared by literally everyone, even people in his inner circle. It was said that he could make anyone disappear in a matter of days. Once, at a Politburo meeting, he joked that he already had a dossier on everyone sitting in the room. Everyone laughed, but the laughter was nervous because no one doubted it. He was telling the truth. What's important to realize is that Stalin didn't keep these people because he trusted them completely. He manipulated them, pitted their interests against each other so that they could not unite. For example, when Beria began to gain too much influence, Stalin forgot to support him in a dispute with Kaganovich, which cost Beria his reputation on one of the committees. These men were not just following orders, they were also fighting for power, but in conditions where one wrong move could cost lives. And now imagine, if such titans lived in constant fear, how did ordinary people feel? Stalin never made important decisions at once. He held secret discussions with his closest associates to understand their moods. For example, before launching repression in the army in the late 1930s, he would hold mini-meetings for weeks to discuss who might be disloyal. If someone spoke out too openly or conversely remained silent, it was recorded as suspicious behavior. In this way, Stalin was not just shaping policy, but also testing who could be trusted. His approach was like a chess game. Before each public decision, he constructed several scenarios where the losers were always left to others, and he came out the winner. For example, many of his arrest decrees were signed under direct pressure. If anyone objected, he quickly disappeared from the Kremlin, as happened with Marshal Igorov. He tried to prove that mass purges among the military would undermine the country's defense capability. The result? Arrest and firing squad. An interesting point. Stalin tried not to show his power openly. He often said, "Decisions are made collectively." But in fact, everyone knew that his word was decisive. One of his most cunning methods was to test his associates for loyalty through small assignments. For example, he could instruct Beria to prepare a list for firing squads, and then instruct Molotov to approve the list. This created the illusion of collective responsibility, although the real power remained in the hands of Stalin. This system worked so effectively that even high-ranking officials were afraid to suggest alternatives. Everyone knew agreement was security, disagreement was a direct threat to life. Thanks to this system, Stalin created a unique mechanism of management where no one felt safe, but everyone continued to work with full dedication. Further, we will tell how these mechanisms were used to suppress conflicts within the team, and why even the closest people Stalin counted the days until his possible disgrace. Many people think that people from Stalin's inner circle were one team, where everyone amicably supported his policies. But this is not true at all. Their relations were more like a battlefield, where everyone was trying to survive, to keep their place and, if possible, to eliminate rivals. And Stalin was like a director who skillfully managed this chaos, not allowing anyone to become too strong. For example, at one of the Politburo meetings, Stalin jokingly suggested shooting one of the team members, allegedly for poor performance. No one laughed. Everyone froze, thinking that this could be a real order. This incident was an example of how Stalin used fear to control. Even a joke could have consequences. What is interesting is that the conflicts were not random. They helped Stalin keep everyone under control. While Beria was arguing with Molotov and Kaganovich was trying to prove his loyalty, none of them thought about uniting against Stalin himself. This whole system was not just a struggle for power, it was a struggle for survival. No real friendship existed within the team. For example, when Polina Jemchugina, Molotov's wife, found herself under arrest, none of her husband's colleagues raised their voices in her defense. On the contrary, many were afraid even to mention her name, so as not to fall under suspicion themselves. A system based on constant conflict not only strengthened Stalin's power, but also destroyed any chance of rebellion or resistance. Further, you will learn who became a victim and who managed to survive, and why the struggle for power after Stalin turned out to be so bloody. When in March 1953 it became known of Stalin's death, the country froze in shock. But those who were closest to power experienced not only the bitterness of loss, but also a real panic. Who will now be in charge? Who will be blamed for past mistakes? And most importantly, how to survive in the new reality where Stalin no longer exists? Immediately after his death began a struggle for power, which in its intensity resembled a detective thriller. Lavrenti Beria, the main head of the NKVD, saw himself as the new leader of the country. He tried to take control by initiating reforms and promising to stop repression. But his rivals quickly realized how dangerous he was. A few months after Stalin's death, Beria was arrested. And it happened not in an open trial, but in a secret operation right at the meeting. He was accused of treason, and in December 1953, he was shot. The other members of Stalin's team did not feel safe either. Molotov, who had been with the dictator almost from the beginning, began to deny his involvement in the repression, saying he was simply following orders. His colleagues did the same. This had its own tragic paradox. People who for years had signed orders for shootings now tried to portray themselves as victims of the system. An example of this is Kaganovich. After Stalin's death, he claimed that he did not know about the scale of repression, although he personally signed documents for the deportation of tens of thousands of people. His attempts to justify himself did not help. He was removed from power and retired, living his last years in complete oblivion. However, the struggle for power after Stalin's death was not only a matter of personal survival. It showed that a system built on fear and intrigue was weaker than it appeared. Without Stalin, no one could hold this complex structure together. One of the major mysteries of the Stalin era is the question of who really controlled the country. Many people believe that Stalin had everything under his personal control, but did he have that ability? For example, in the 1940s, he led major reforms, built factories, and developed weapons. But how deeply did he delve into the details of these processes? Historians still argue whether he was a sole leader or whether everything was kept on his shadow team. Interestingly, even now, decades later, some documents about this team remain classified. What is hidden there? Perhaps answers to questions about how decisions were made, who influenced policy, and who was just an executor. But the fact is that we may never know the full picture.